Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm really excited to be here in Toronto. It's my first time in Toronto. I live in New York City and I'm originally from Mississippi, if anyone was wondering. So I'm going to deliver the keynote for you tonight, and what that means for me is my style is actually really interactive, so I'm hoping that this will be a participatory experience, that I'm not just going to be talking at you for half an hour, but that we're going to be engaging in somewhat of a back and forth, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. I have some slides that will be projected over here. Hopefully I'm going to be talking enough that will sort of get to the point of what's up there, but just so you know, they're over there to sort of support what's happening. I want to set up two sort of guiding principles for our time together tonight. And this is what I would ask of you, these two things: to be open and to be engaged. So the open part to me means if you're here because you want to support the creation of the LGBTQ Toolkit, and you're like, but I know that stuff already, right? Then my challenge to you is to be open to hearing sort of old information in new ways that you might not have heard it before, right? And if you feel like I'm here to learn something new, I don't really know so much about this LGBTQ thing, then my challenge to you is to be open to hearing some new information, right? So just being open, that's it. And then being engaged means I get really distracted by some things, like lots of extra noises or lots of cell phone activity. I am a professor, I teach a lot, and it really does. I go off on some sort of tangent, I lose my train of thought. It's really disastrous for everyone involved. So I don't know. I mean, if you have to do that, you have to do it, but try to do it like down here where I can't see it. That's the be engaged part. And if I ask questions, please answer them, because that will make this all the more engaging for everyone involved. So I'm going to start by talking to you a little bit about the work that I do now, so you know where I'm coming from. So I'm the director of an organization or program called the 40 to None Project. And the 40 to None Project gets its name from the frequently cited statistic that in the United States, up to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So I will use an acronym during my talk. I will say LGBT, sometimes LGBTQ. Sometimes I might say queer. I use all of these interchangeably, and I recognize that that acronym doesn't fully encompass the multiple ways that people identify. So I just want to say that now, that I'll use those terms interchangeably. So the 40 to None Project was started after a year-long assessment in the United States, traveling the country and figuring out what the landscape was like for LGBTQ youth homelessness. And what we decided was that we needed to figure out how to create a consolidated voice around the issue, right? That there are people doing amazing direct services all over the country, and in fact all over the world, definitely the continent. And we didn't want to duplicate that because that's already being done. But we wanted to find a way to support those organizations and making sure that they have the tools, the resources they need to do the work. So that's where the 40 to None Project came about. We work in 5 key program areas. We work in broad-based public education. We work in advocacy, predominantly at the federal level, also some state level advocacy. We do empowerment programs for young people. We participate in research, and then we do capacity building and inclusion work. So that is going into providers and making sure that they have what they need to create inclusive and affirming services. So 2 things that I'll mention now that you can follow up on if you like. On our website, we're building the largest, what we hope will be the largest online directory of inclusive and affirming service providers for LGBT youth. So young people can go there to the website. They can access providers wherever they're located and wherever they need help. That also allows us to direct potential funders and volunteers to the website. So if people call me and say, hey, I'm in Toronto and I want to know how I can get more involved, my response would be, see if there's any providers listed on our directory and go support your local service provider. So that's the work that we do there. Today, we launched the 40 to None Network, which is meant to connect people working on the issue of LGBT youth homelessness or whose work has the ability to impact LGBT youth experiencing homelessness. So we're really looking at cross-system collaboration and making sure that everyone's on the same page. So we're looking for educators, policymakers, direct service providers, government folks, researchers, right? Everybody to get on board so that we can have a consolidated effort at addressing the issue. So that's my pitch about the organization. Now on to more exciting things. I'm going to start with an activity. This activity is called the Impact of Silence. I'm going to ask you to participate in it. This is how it goes. I would like you to think of a person that is super, super important to you in your life. Whoever pops into your head, right? So got that person in your head. Everybody good? Okay. So now I would like you to think about 3 things that you spend a lot of time doing. You don't have to like them, but just 3 things that you spend most of the time in your life doing. Got that? Okay. Now I would like you to turn to someone, preferably someone you don't know, but it's okay if you know them already, I suppose, and introduce yourself. You can't mention that person or make any reference to that person, including pronouns, and you cannot mention any of those 3 things that you spend all your time doing. So introduce yourself to someone beside you. Go. So, what was that like?
Horrible.
Horrible. Why was it horrible?
I could not use a pronoun.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That was hard.
Yeah, I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Can't do it.
What else? What was it like for other folks?
Hilarious.
Hilarious?
Yeah, she thought it was hilarious.
Okay. So we have horrible and hilarious. Difficult? Awkward. You get the gist, right? This is what it can be like for young people, LGBT young people who are coming into our programs, right? Or who are interacting with you on a daily basis. The energy that it takes to think about, oh, I can and can't say this, oh, I can and can't mention that person, oh, I can't say my boyfriend or my girlfriend, and I can't talk about the gay club I went to last night, or I can't talk about how I always go to this one community center to this person, but I can to this person. That sort of energy that it takes, right, to navigate that sort of switching between who you can say what to and when and how really takes a lot of effort, right? And if you're supposed to be working on your quote-unquote stability, right, and getting housing or going back to school or getting a job or whatever it is that you're supposed to do and engage with you as a provider and making that happen, how can that happen when you can't even bring your own self, full self there, right? So our goal is to create spaces where young people can bring their full selves, right? So they don't have to spend so much energy doing all those other things. My goal for us tonight is, my goal for you is to give you some things to think about and to talk about this in a way that you may not have talked about it before. I really want to push the conversation forward. I was just saying earlier when I first got here that I've been doing these workshops for many, many years, and I turned to someone, I was co-facilitating a workshop a couple of days ago with someone from the Trevor Project, and I turned to that person afterwards and I was like, we've been having the same conversation for 10 years. And he was like, yeah, we have. And I was like, it's time we had a different conversation, right? So we're having a different conversation. I'm excited about it. And I'm going to start with this quote. And you're going to see this a lot throughout the course of our time together tonight. I can't say who I am unless you agree I'm real. I'm going to say anything else about that. I think it speaks for itself. And I'm going to keep bringing it into our conversation tonight. So to kick us off, before I can talk about how we can do better by our LGBTQ youth in our programs, right? I want to start off by talking about oppression. Because we have to think about the context that LGBT youth are existing in before we can talk about how we're going to work with them in a better way, right? So to do that, talk about oppression. So one definition of oppression is an unjust use of power. Sure, I could elaborate on that, but for the purpose of this talk right now, I'm going to go with that. Is everybody okay with that? An unjust use of power. Okay. So when I think about oppression, I think about it on at least 4 different levels. And I think about these as the 4 I's of oppression. So it's sort of easy to remember because all of these start with the letter I. And at the top, the biggest, broadest level of oppression is the ideological level of oppression. The big idea driving oppression, right? The big idea then dictates what happens in our institutions, the institutional level. So the policies, practices, laws, things that go on in our society, directly informed by that big idea, right? Within our institutions, there are people that interact interpersonally, directly informed by laws, policies, procedures, like the building code, directly informed by the big idea, right? And then within those interactions, there's an individual person that internalizes what goes on, right? And so that's the cycle of oppression. All 4 of these levels serve to reinforce the other, right? Does everybody get that? Great. Again, with the quote, I can't say who I am unless you agree that I'm real. So we're thinking about the ways that we oppress people and don't allow them to say who they are, right? All right, so here's some examples of ideological oppression, that big idea, right? As humans, I think we find ways to oppress other people all the time. We've been doing it for a really long time. We oppress people based on their skin color, based on their class, based on their education status, right? We find ways to oppress people. So the big idea behind oppression based on race, for example, is called racism. Based on sex is called, and class, ethnicity, ethnocentrism. Right, they're right up here on the slide. You can just read them. All right, so my question for you then is, what is the big idea driving oppression related to sexual orientation? What's that called? Anybody know? I hear some like whispers. Homophobia. Homophobia is absolutely a form of oppression related to sexual orientation. What's the big idea behind it? Heterosexism, right? Okay. And then what about related to gender identity and expression? Cissexism. Yes. All right. Thank you. So heterosexism, cissexism. I will also say heteronormativity and cisnormativity. And don't worry, those will be defined. The biggest, broadest level, ideological oppression related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Heterosexism and cisnormativity. These things produce homophobia and transphobia. It's really important that we talk about this biggest level, right? Because that's where the system change can happen. We can keep working at the individual level to make sure that we as individual people don't interact with other individual people in a homophobic or a transphobic manner, but that doesn't change the systems that we've created that actually enact homophobia and transphobia. They actually sanction homophobia and transphobia, right? So here's some definitions. This is what Audre Lorde has to say about heterosexism. This is her definition for heterosexism. A belief in the inherent superiority of one form of loving over all others and thereby the right to dominance. That's one definition of heterosexism. Another is a system of attitudes, bias, and discrimination in favor of dichotomous same-sex, opposite sex, sorry, woo, we know where I'm at. Oops, in favor of dichotomous opposite sex sexuality and relationships. Heterosexism, heteronormativity. Just to break it down a little bit more. Heterosexism, the big idea here is the assumption that everyone is heterosexual. So that's the way that we've built our systems, assuming that everybody's heterosexual, right? It's a form of oppression that targets LGBTQ people, and it confers rights and privileges to heterosexual people that are denied to LGBTQ people. So homophobia, then, is a direct result of heterosexism. It's the product. And when we have systems and laws and policies in place that are heterosexist, it gives permission for people to enact that at the individual level, right? So a definition for homophobia: fear of or contempt for lesbians and gay men, individual behavior based on that feeling, like bullying, like that's so gay, right? Like the way that we use language. So I have a question for you, true or false? Everyone has a sexual orientation. Turn to your neighbor and discuss. Figure out your answer. True or false? Everyone has a sexual orientation. Okay. Tell me what you decided. Who says everybody has a sexual orientation? True. Some people say it's true. People think it's false? People think it's false. Okay, I'm going to say it's true. I'm going to say everybody has a sexual orientation. Doesn't mean you're having sex. There are different sexual orientations. There are probably some that I'm not even aware of because there are labels that are changing all the time. But generally, people may identify as heterosexual. People may identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, perhaps pansexual, right? But that people have a sexual orientation. We just typically talk about the other. That's the way that we construct it, right? We don't think about the fact that everybody actually has this. It's a part of who everyone is. Again, right? I can't say who I am unless you agree I'm real. Let me talk about transphobia for a quick second here. This is the Transgender Day of Remembrance, and transphobia is very real in our world. So one definition of transphobia is one's discomfort, aversion, or fear of people who are gender diverse or ambiguous. Transphobia often leads to a spectrum of behaviors, conscious or unconscious, that are non-affirming, discriminatory, and or violent. And the thing that I want to highlight right now in this definition is the conscious or unconscious part, right? So certainly there are people in the world that very consciously attack people based on their gender identity and expression. That happens. I also want you to think a little critically about the unconscious piece, right? That just because someone didn't mean to be transphobic doesn't mean that it wasn't experienced in that way, right? And so when we talk about this sort of bigger system piece, it's important for us to think about how actually our participation in some of these systems may require us to behave in a way that is non-affirming for trans and gender nonconforming people, right? So that's where I want to take that conversation. I want you to be thinking about the ways that you may unconsciously, because of the systems we're involved in, be enacting homophobia and transphobia. So I'm going to put that on the side for a minute and have you keep thinking about that while we talk about the work that we do. So again, where does this come from? Where does transphobia come from? What's the big idea that drives transphobia? We talked about it earlier. Someone over here said it out loud. Cissexism or cisnormativity, right? That's the big idea that creates and produces and recreates transphobia. So a definition then for cissexism and cisnormativity. They're the belief system underlying transphobia. It's the big idea behind transphobia, right? It's the assumption that all people are cisgender. Wait a minute, that all people are what? That all people are cisgender. One definition of, and you notice that I say one definition of because there are many varying ways and more elaborate definitions. So I'm going to say one definition of cisgender is people who identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, right? So I'll walk you through that in just a minute. But people who identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. And a piece of cisnormativity then is that there are two options, that you will be assigned male or female, and that you will grow up to identify with, live as, and ascribe to the gendered norms associated with that sex you're assigned at birth. That's cisnormativity. Can't we just say non-trans? We can't. And let me tell you why. Because we're always naming the quote-unquote other, right? So if we say non-trans, we continue to create a world in which there are people and there are trans people, or there are non-trans people and there are trans people. But we're not naming everyone's gender identity, right? So there are trans people, transgender people, and there are cisgender people. And a lot of people really have a hard time with that word, I've found in my travels and in the training that I do. And I think sometimes it can be hard to learn new words, but I also think we do it all the time. So when we have a hard time, or have a negative reaction to a particular word, I think it's important that we stop and say, wait a minute, what else is there underneath this word? Like, why am I having a reaction to this particular word, right? Cisnormativity systematically erases transgender people and their needs by not making a space for people to say who they are. and it confers rights and privileges to cisgender people that are denied to transgender and gender nonconforming people. I'm going to break it down a little more, so don't worry. But first, true or false? Discuss with your neighbor. Everyone has a gender identity. Can I have your attention again? Thank you. All right, so what do we think? True or false? Everyone has a gender identity. True. Here's some truths. Okay. I'm going to say it's true. I'm going to say it's true. I'm going to say we just don't talk about it much. We don't think about it much, right? We don't name it in the same way. So I can't say who I am unless you agree that I'm real. Let me walk through cisnormativity and the way that it can play out, just to make sure that it's clear what I'm talking about. So this baby is born with a penis. We put a blue diaper on him. He's assigned, what sex do you think? Boy. He's born with a penis. He's assigned boy. It's a boy, right? So cisnormativity in action. One's anatomy equals their gender assignment. That's sort of the way the world has worked. Then there are certain types of behaviors or expectations that go along with being a boy in the world. The way boys play, the way boys dress, who boys date, right? Boys date girls. There's all these expectations that come along with being a boy. So then that person's gender assignment is used to presume their gender expression, right? And their sexual orientation. So those are the ways that these things play out. I want to talk for a second now. I want to take it away from that and from the sort of heady way of thinking about it with all the words and the true-false questions, and just tell you a story. A story about how this can translate into experience, how someone can experience those 4 different levels of oppression that we talked about related to gender identity and expression. So stories about me, because why not? Because I'm the person talking to you and I know myself well. Better to talk about myself than about someone else in this situation. So I drink a lot of coffee. I had a really big Americano before I gave this talk, which may be why I'm talking sort of fast. So I really love coffee. And there's, in New York City, where I live, there are about 4,000 Starbucks all over the place. And think what you will about Starbucks. I go there a lot because it's consistent. Like I always know what I'm going to get. And I travel a lot, so judge me. But I go to Starbucks because I know what I'm going to get. And even though there are 4,000 Starbucks in New York City, they're always crowded. It doesn't matter what time of day I go, and it doesn't matter which one I go to, it's always crowded. But Starbucks has worked out a great system for making the line move more quickly, which is they have a person that talks to you while you're in line with their headset, and they tell them what you want, and they radio it in, and then miraculously when you get up to the counter, you talk to the person, they give you your coffee, and the day is glorious. So I was at this Starbucks. I look like I look, and I was wearing a bow tie, and I was on my way to teach a class, and I told the person what I wanted, and I got up to the counter, and the person said, behind the counter said, "What did you have?" And I said, "I had a grande misto," and he said, "Oh, you got me." And I said, "Hmm?" And he said, "I totally thought you were a dude." I took my coffee, and I just sort of walked out quickly. And this is why I'm telling you this story, because the big idea there, right? The big idea was that there are males in the world and there are females in the world, and I'm going to be able to look at a person and tell if they are a male or if they are a female. And if I don't, then I guess tell by looking when they talk, I'll certainly know who they are, right? So that's sort of the big idea driving this interaction that I had with this person. And then I think about the institutional level, and I think about why did that happen? How was this an institutional level thing? Because I really don't think that this person was being malicious on purpose, right? I don't think that was sort of oh, I'm going to get this person. I'm going to really give it to them today. I don't think that's where this person was coming from, right? So then I think about customer service and the service industry. How many people here have worked in the service industry before? Okay, so I have 2. I've worked in the service industry, and I don't know. I know what this is like being trained to work in the service industry in the southern part of the United States. I don't know what it's like here. But are there certain ways that you're trained to show respect to customers through language? Sir and ma'am, right? So then I think, okay, maybe, granted I haven't talked to anyone at Starbucks about this, so I don't know if this is true, but this is the meaning that I made out of it, right? That big idea then creates institutional level policies, which are like, when someone comes and gets something from you in the service industry, you show respect by saying, thank you, ma'am. What were you having, sir? Right? That's institutionalized as part of training for many people. So then that trickles down into the interpersonal interaction, which I don't need to explain to you because I just told you what it was, right? Directly informed by that institutional policy, perhaps, which is directly informed by that big idea of cisnormativity. And then how did that impact me as an individual person in that interaction, right? I took my coffee and I left. And I'm a person with a super strong ego who does this work for a living. And I took my coffee and left. And then I got outside and I was like, I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe I just walked out and I didn't say something. Oh my gosh, I have to go back and say something right now. I'm gonna go back and let that guy know what's what. I'm going back in there. And then I was like, I don't have time, I'm gonna be late for my class. I can't be late for my class, I have to go teach. My students, I hope none of my students were in there. What if my students were in there and they saw that? Oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. What if my students were in there and they saw that I didn't say anything and this is what I do for a living? That's horrible. I am never going back to that Starbucks again. Why should I not be able to go back to that Starbucks? It's my favorite Starbucks, it's the most convenient. That's stupid, right? So on and on and on and on. And obviously it's still pretty emotionally charged, right? Like I've sort of let it go. I use it for training, but I'm still thinking about it, right? So that's one example of one situation that happened at one time and one day with a grown-up who's really secure about who they are and who does this work for a living. The stakes are much higher, right? When someone is going to a medical provider or a social service provider or someone who has something that they need to survive, right? This one is not a talk to your neighbor activity. I just want you to sort of think this through yourself for a minute, what assumptions you make. Just associated with the words. I'll say the words out loud and I'll put them up on the screen, but just think to yourself what immediately comes to mind. What assumptions do you make about lesbians? With the word lesbian, when you hear lesbian. Questioning. That's a term we use a lot in the States. I don't know if you use it here. Lesbian, questioning. Pansexual. Bisexual. Two-spirit. Transgender. Genderqueer. Queer. Gay. So just sit with whatever assumptions that may have come up, whatever ideas that you may have had when thinking critically about these words. And I know that this is not an exhaustive list. They're the words that I chose. And let's think about for a minute now in our society. So hold on to what those assumptions were. And let's think about, for a minute in our society, the bigger examples of heterosexism, cisnormativity that exist. And I'll get us started because I want us to sort of brainstorm together. I'll get us started, right? So the thinking about laws and policies, et cetera, the marriage movement, right? So that's something that everyone does not have access to, right? So what other things like that exist in our world? Yep.
I'm applying for a master's right now, and I had to fill out a form on McGill's web online thing. I have 4 moms, so one of the required fields was father's first name and last name, and mother's first name and last name. This is something that I've come up against over and over again since junior kindergarten in our schools. Yeah, so.
Perfect example, thank you. Forms of all kinds, and not just forms about your own self, but also about your family and what your family looks like. Yeah. Public bathrooms, absolutely. What else? Yeah. Sports teams. Yep. Child custody, yeah. Yep. Shelters, indeed. Gym class? Mm-hmm.
An individual's name.
Names.
Yeah. My name is Carmen.
And people make all kinds of assumptions when they hear that your name is Carmen.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Any others? Medical forms, absolutely. And health insurance in general. Language, absolutely. Yep. Dating sites. Yeah.
These assumptions about like who you're most comfortable with, like the women will be more comfortable with female nurses.
Yep. Travel. TSA. I just had some good experiences with the TSA today. I might tell you about those over cocktails later. I don't know. So the point here, I'm going to read some out loud. Sorry, the letters are a little off. Media. So thinking about representation in the media. And do you see people, can young people, LGBTQ young people see themselves reflected in the media? Laws, policy, programs. We have programs for boys and programs for girls, and how do we then determine who's a boy and who's a girl to go into those programs? Paperwork, we talked about textbooks, assignments people are given in school, advertising, books, marriage equality, religion, music, frozen dinners. I don't know if you have these in Toronto, but do you know what I'm talking about? Hungry Man. There's Hungry Man, and then there's like the lean cuisines, right? Like that's how the grocery stores are set up. There's also now, I need to update this with the new Diet Dr. Pepper commercial, which talks about the manliest diet soda you'll ever have, right? That's a real thing. That's a real advertisement. Here's a manly diet soda for you. So thinking about those things. Bathrooms, the Boy Scouts, clothing. Clothing is huge. Toys, right? So the reason I wanted to bring up this slide in particular and have us think about these messages that we and the young people we work with are bombarded with on a day-to-day basis. And I want you to think about that and then think about the assumptions that may have popped into your head with those words, that definitely pop into many people's heads that aren't in this room, right? And of course, those happen because this is the world we live in, right? Our messages, the messages that we send generally to most of society are based on this heteronormative and cisnormative way of being. So it creates certain assumptions and associations that people will make. That doesn't excuse those. It doesn't make those okay. It just means that we have to work in two levels here. We have to work on making sure that people have the tools to be able to interact in a way that's affirming and inclusive. And we also have to be doing some work at the systemic level to create different kinds of systems, to break down the systems that are currently there that systematically erase the existence of entire groups of people. On Transgender Day of Remembrance, I would be really remiss if I didn't talk about the way that the media often portrays trans people after they're dead, right? So often the media will talk about someone based on the sex they were assigned at birth and a name that they were given by their parents in the mainstream media. So then they're further erased after they're dead. How much more could you try to obliterate the existence of a person? I mean, just think about that. Not only while they were alive in both subtle and overt ways, but then again, when they're gone, it's just something to really think about. That's not typically a part of this talk, but the day needs to be recognized, and that's a really important part of this day. I want us to now translate this into the social service agency. So we're taking those different levels of oppression that we talked about, and we're going to take them out of the mainstream cultural experience. We're going to take them out of like heady thinking, take them out of the Starbucks that I talked about, and bring them into your agencies, right? So if the big idea driving the creation of a social service agency is that everyone is cisgender and heterosexual, if that's the big idea driving it, what institutional policies and practices exist that come from that big idea that can create barriers for the LGBTQ young people trying to access services? Tell me what some of those are. What are those institutional policies and practices? Bathrooms. What else?
Having separate male and female floors.
Segregating the rooms and floors. Yeah.
Forms at intake.
The forms at intake. Yes? ID. Can you say a little more about it?
If you're forced to give identification to prove who you are, or you
Right.
require any health services and your card does not match what gender you represent.
Absolutely. Yep.
Or was there gender bias? Like, girls' night.
Okay. Yeah. And this is not to say that there are not positive aspects of having a girls' room or a girls' group, right? But it's about how we define who gets to go there, right? How are we defining girl? Are we letting a girl define herself as a girl? Because if so, then okay, right? But are we deciding who's a girl and who's a boy? So I just want to be clear about that part, because I do think that these sex segregation in programs and in bathrooms and all of that is really problematic, especially bathrooms, especially for trans and gender nonconforming people. But I don't want to come across as saying like, oh, there should never be any space for just like girls or women or men or boys. But it's more about us letting people say who they are. Any other examples of institutional policies and practices? Hiring practices and policies. Can you say a little more about it?
Around representation.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yep. Also, dress codes, depending on sort of where you work and what your role is, but dress codes in terms of like what boys wear and what girls wear. Formally, like uniforms, and also informally, like what's appropriate, right? The cultural norm around what's worn. And then the way that all these things translate into interpersonal interactions. So thinking about the interpersonal interactions that happen in that space with those policies and practices that you've just talked about. What do those interactions look like? And how might they be not affirming for LGBT youth?
Well, you would have cases where someone is assigned to a shelter not of their choice, and there just isn't something in the system for them. And I've actually seen cases where it's been really traumatic for the person involved, and it's not really picked up on by the system around them until sometimes it's too late.
So people get sent to shelters that they didn't choose to go to?
That's right.
Is that okay?
Or they're for a certain population, and it doesn't. They haven't seen their needs identified.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
If you have forms that only have male or female, and then that completely erases any other sort of identity, right? And
Right.
if they're not included, then they don't exist.
Yeah. And thinking about how interactions will come out of how those interpersonal interactions happen because of that, right? And this gets back to your point earlier about questions, and people feel like they have the right to know, right? So oftentimes a trans or gender nonconforming person then is asked all kinds of questions about their bodies and about what they do with their bodies, right? All these questions because people are so curious, right? People want to know. There's actually, I don't have the slides in this presentation, but there's a website called I believe it's called the Trans Photo Project, and it has photos of trans people holding sort of signs up of questions that they've been asked, right? Real questions that they've been asked. So that's another way that interpersonal interactions can be impacted by these policies. Also, if you're not asking people who they are, and they don't have the opportunity to tell you who they are, then how are you going to know if you're using the name that they want to use and the pronoun that they want to use, right? So if we're getting back to the idea of the IDs, if you need an identification card to get services, is that identification card also the thing that a chart or an electronic record or whatever, however you keep records, is it created from that ID card? And did anyone ever ask that person if that was the name and the pronoun that they use? Because if not, they're suddenly in the system as another person, right? And then how does that get filtered out into what programs they're sent to, what groups they're allowed to go to, what medical services they have access to, right? So then, how does that get internalized by that person who has come for help to these services, and they've navigated all of that terrain to get to the paper that doesn't allow them to say who they are, or to have that interaction where someone is like, oh, I totally thought you were a dude, right? Or, I don't believe that you're a girl. You're going to have to prove that to me somehow, right? So how does that get internalized in that young person? How might they feel? Isolated.
Yeah, like they don't want to go back.
They don't want to go back. And excluded, someone said. Angry. Scared. Of lesser value. Invisible. Not real. Any others?
It can like make you question your own identities if people are like, no, there's only men and women or whatever it is, or like, no, you don't like, you're not the thing that you think you are. You can
Absolutely.
take that on.
Absolutely, yeah. If we don't let people say or believe that people actually have the knowledge to be able to say who they are, then we create a situation where that person is like, well, wait, who do I even know? Who am I, right? A range of ways that this can manifest internally, right? There is no right or wrong answer to this question. There are multiple ways that a person can internalize this. And it's important to think about then how these internalized beliefs manifest in behavior. And this connects it back again to that big picture. So I've done a lot of trainings with organizations on providing an inclusive and affirming workplace environment. So not necessarily for the people that come to their programs, although that's definitely a part of it, but also for the staff, right? So we want to have staff that identify in the same ways that the young people that come to our programs identify, right? But we need to make sure our system is set up to then accommodate those staff people. And one of the things that I'm most often confronted with is that person's just always so angry. They're always so loud and angry, right? So can you put that in the context then of all of those layers that I just took you through, right? That person is not so angry. Or if they are, they have a right to be. That person is responding in the best way they know how to all of the systemic punches in the face they've just received, right? Every day, all day long. So when we think about youth and youth behavior and the way that we manage youth, we could talk about mental health. We could talk about anxiety and depression and oppositional defiant disorder. We could talk about those all day long, right? And maybe that stuff maybe that's really happening. If we're talking about an LGBT youth existing in these systems, maybe they're responding to the environment around them in the best way they know how, right? Can't say who you am unless you agree that I'm real. And what I would really like you to do now, and I'm going to give this one a little bit longer than the time I gave before, am I? Yeah? I'm going to give 1 extra minute. To turn to someone beside you and talk about this. How do you say I'm real? How do you even do that? So either how are you doing it now in your work environment, in your programs, or how do you imagine you could? How can you do it? Go. All right. So I just want to hear one or two, maybe three ideas about how you can say folks are real. How can you communicate this in your work? Did anybody come up with anything? Yes.
Well, I think one really important way, like you can say, like, or express that other people are real is by noticing the differences and not assuming that because you're all LGBT LGB or LGBT, that even that's, like the LGB is separate from the T a lot of the time, right? But like just to not assume that everybody's the same.
Yeah.
So there's a whole intersectional piece that we haven't really talked about yet, which
Right.
race plays into, or racism plays into, and disableism, and so many
Absolutely.
other things too. Class, that like LGBT youth are not all the same.
Yep.
And so being aware of that is a key part, I think, of like allowing people to be real.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm really glad you brought up the intersectionality piece. And I'm remembering, because I don't have my script with me tonight, I'm remembering one of the things that I typically say when I talk about oppression at the beginning is, if this was like a weekend retreat, we would spend a lot of time talking about the ways that all of those different forms of oppression that I put on the board, which was not an exhaustive list by any means, we would talk about the ways that all of those intersect and reinforce one another. But because of the time and because we're talking about LGBT youth, I didn't do that, right? I didn't talk about any of those others. It's a really important point. All LGBT youth are not the same. All LGB youth are not the same. You get it, right? What else? Yeah.
Well, this is the first time I've ever heard what you're sharing with us.
Yeah.
And some of the words I wasn't even familiar with.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're educating us.
Great.
I mean, we've been indoctrinated from day one, from since I was born, to think the way I do.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be, you know, we have to change that, and that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate that comment and think it's a really important one. So thank you. And I appreciate your willingness to learn new words, right? Yep.
I work for a youth organization in Newfoundland, and one of the things we just did was committed to and proceeded to carry out training with our entire staff team around a lot of the issues that you're bringing forward. And the number one thing that resonated with staff, and we had huge positive feedback, was language.
Mm-hmm.
So we had all these staff really trained, really committed to, you know, everything we're talking about here tonight, but without the right words, right? The fear of saying the wrong thing stopped them from saying anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really powerful for staff to like, thank you, I have some words I can use now.
Yeah, absolutely. So words both on forms, as we've talked about, and words both in terms of words that you speak out loud, right? And then also making room for people to tell you which words they use. Because you may not know the words, I might not know the words, right? Language is ever evolving. One more thought, yeah.
I think like if you're gonna talk to people about their identities, ask them what their pronouns are and stuff, if you are gonna bring that stuff in, to make sure to do it with everybody, because otherwise it's really othering. If you're like, oh, you look trans, what are your pronouns?
Yep, absolutely.
And that goes for not just pronouns, but I was just using that as an example, but it goes for like anything where you're like asking people about their identities.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. And this is, a lot of times when I do trainings, we talk more in-depth trainings, we talk a lot about language, and questions inevitably always come up around pronouns. And so I'll talk a lot about pronouns. It's definitely not just about pronouns. Like it's about more than pronouns, but pronouns are important because it's the piece of language that we use that inherently makes an assumption about another person, and we speak it out loud, right? So that's a really important piece of it. And what I'll say in terms of how do you say I'm real, again, is yes, if you're gonna do it with one, you do it with all, because you're changing the systemic way that you interact with people. I went to the same Starbucks, different worker, different experience, and at Starbucks they always ask you your name, right, to write on the cup. My experience with her changed the way that I think about whenever I ask anyone any information, right? Because she said to me, my name is Danielle, what's your name? And I was like, oh my gosh, that just changed this interaction so much. And so I think about that. If I'm gonna ask a young person who's sitting in front of me their pronoun, I'm gonna tell them mine, right? And if that feels weird to you, practice doing it with your friends and practice doing it in the mirror, because I'm telling you, that's where we're going. That's what needs to happen, right? If we're gonna change the way that we think about people and think about gender and the assumptions we make about it, we're gonna have to start having that conversation. Yeah.
Along the lines of practice, I think all that language will come
with practice. Like, it's going to be awkward at first, like things like gender neutral pronouns and even saying like the word trans and so many things that you don't usually say. It all takes practice, so it's not awkward for anybody. Yeah. Talk about it with your friends.
Yeah, and that's one of the workshops that I do that I really enjoy a lot is totally like practicing language. And then at the end, it's like, now you can never say you never did that because you just did, and you did it well, right? So maybe when we're having the reception in a minute, we can just, I don't know, come talk to me, come ask me my pronoun, I'll, tell me yours, practice with me. That's why I'm here. So in the interest of time, this is what I'll say. These are not the only things you can do, but here are some suggestions to get started, because you can't suddenly go back to work and be like, I have to ask everybody who they are and do that in a vacuum, right? If your environment is not set up in a way that communicates it's okay for you to be who you are and it's okay for you to tell me who you are, then don't go in there and be like, are you gay? Like, you can't do that, right? So some subtle ways that you can begin to shift your physical environment are through language. So we've talked a lot about language. So through the language that you use and through the questions you ask people. Visual cues that symbolize like all folks are welcome here. Community engagement. So being involved with your local LGBTQ community center, if there is one, going to a parade, going to an event, making yourself known as the organization that does this work. Affirming policies and practices. Perfect little sign here about an all-gender restroom. And then learning more. So these are 2 books that I happen to put up there, but there are plenty of like personal stories, research, the best practices that exist. So it's on you to learn more, right? So that's another thing that you can do to make a better space. So I'm going to say that's the end of my talking, because apparently I've talked a little bit longer than I planned. So if anybody has questions, we can have questions now, or we can have questions later.